The Law of Dependent Arising. The Secret to Bondage and Release. Sermon 20. By Bhikkhu K Ñāṇananda. Narrated by Bhikkhu Candana. Pahankanua Sermon number 202. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage be to the Fortunate One, the Worthy, fully enlightened. Ye me pubbe vyakangsu hurango tama sasana. Ichchasi iti bhavissati sabbānaṃ iti tihang. Sabbānaṃ takkavadhanang nāhaṃ tattha abhiraming. Tvancha me dhamma akhahi tanha nighātanang muni. Yang viditva sato charang tare loke visattikang. Idha ditha sutamuta vinyatesu piyarupesu hemaka chanda raga vinodanang Nibbāna padamacchutang. Etad anyaya ye sata ditha dhamma bhinibbuta upasantava te sada tinna loke visattikang. Hemaka Sutta, Sutta Nibbāna. Those who explained to me before, outside the dispensation of Gautama, all of them said, so it was and so it will be. But all that is so and so talk. All that is productive of logic. I do not delight therein. But now to me, O sage, may you proclaim a Dhamma that is destructive of craving, by knowing which and mindfully faring along, one might get beyond the world's viscosity. The dispelling here in this world of desire and lust for pleasant things, seen, heard, sensed, and cognized, is Nibbāna that slips not away. Knowing this, they that are mindful and are fully appeased here and now are always calm and composed. They have crossed the world's viscosity. Dear listeners, the uniqueness of the law of dependent arising discovered by the fully enlightened one is the presenting of a solution to the samsaric problem in the present itself. Until then, religious teachers in the world went on searching for a solution by entwining past and future with logic. In this well-preached Svākkhāta Dhamma, what becomes obvious by the other qualities like Sanditthiko can be seen here and now, Akāliko, timeless, Ehipassiko, inviting one to come and see, Opanayiko, leading one onwards, and, by the term often used, Ditteva Dhamme, in this very life, is that solution in the present. Today, we chose as the topic for the 20th sermon on dependent arising the Hemaka Sutta of the Parayana Vagga in Sutta Nibbāna, in order to turn your attention to this unique quality. Paraphrased, this is the meaning of those verses. 1. Ye me pubbe vyakangsu hurango tama sasana. Those who, outside the dispensation of Gautama, explained to me before, Ichchasi iti bhavissati, said so, it was, so it will be. Sabbānaṃ iti tihang, all that is, so it was talk. Sabbānaṃ takkavadhanang, all that is productive of logic. Nāhaṃ tattha abhiraming, I did not delight in it. 2. Tvancha me dhammang akhahi, tanha nighātanang muni. but may you preach to me the Dhamma that destroys craving, O sage. Yang viditva sato charang tare loke visattikang. Having understood which, and faring mindfully, one can cross over from world's viscosity. 3. Idha ditha sutamuta vinyatesu piyarupesu hemaka. In regard to pleasant things seen, heard, sensed, and cognized here in this world, O hemaka. Chanda raga vinodanang Nibbāna padamachyutang. The dispelling of desire and lust is the state of Nibbāna, that does not slip away. 4. Etad anyaya ye sata ditha dhamma bhinibbuta. Knowing this, those that are mindful and fully appeased here and now, upasantava te sada tinna loke visattikang, are always calm and composed, and they have crossed over the viscosity in this world. In a previous sermon, we happened to mention that according to the exposition in the Visuddhimagga that is now accepted, out of the 12 links, the 2 links, ignorance and preparations, avidya sankhara, are reckoned as belonging to the past. The last 2 links, birth, decay, and death, as belonging to the future. And the 8 links in the middle, consciousness, name and form, 6 sense spheres, contact, feeling, craving, grasping, and becoming, vijnana, nama rupa, salayatana, passa, vedana, tanha, upadana, bhava, as belonging to the present. If we accept that exposition, that interpretation, what the Brahmin youth Hemaka had stated as a charge against other religious systems, the explaining as so it was and so it will be, that is to say, the so-and-so charge could be leveled at our Dhamma as well. But, dear listeners, this is not a so-and-so Dhamma. This is something unique. In support of his interpretation, Venerable Buddhaghosa, the author of Visuddhimagga, gives a 20-fold analysis of Paṭicca Samuppāda made up of groups of 5. Atite hetavo pancha idani phala panchakang idani hetavo pancha ayating phala panchakang. 5 causes were in the past. Now there is a 5-fold fruit. Now there are 5 causes, which will have in future a 5-fold fruit. In the past there were 5 causes. In the present there are the 5 fruits. There are 5 causes in the present, of which there will be 5 fruits in the future. What are these 5 causes? Ignorance, preparations, craving, grasping, and becoming. What are said to be the 5 fruits in the present? Consciousness, name and form, 6 sense spheres, contact, and feeling. Then again, the 5 present causes are said to be ignorance, preparations, craving, grasping, and becoming, and the 5 fruits are consciousness, name and form, 6 sense spheres, contact, and feeling. By this analysis, the wonderful interconnection between the 12 links, which is called idhappacchayata, specific conditionality, is breached. We have already explained to you all that the basic principle of the law of dependent arising obtains between any 2 consecutive links of the formula. That is to say, this being, this comes to be. With the arising of this, this arises. This not being, this does not come to be. With the cessation of this, this ceases. The law holds good between any pair of links. It cannot be broken. It cannot take in additional things. Any 2 links are wonderfully interconnected. It is reinforced by the significant phrase, Ya tatra tathata avitathata ananyathata idappacchayata. That suchness, that invariability, that not otherwiseness therein is the specific conditionality. The Buddha has thus confirmed that connection. We have to point out that by the analysis in the Visuddhimagga, that basic principle is violated. Not only that, Venerable Buddhaghosa speaks of 3 rounds or vattas, namely Kilesha Vatta, the round of defilements, the Kamma Vatta, the round of action, and Vipaka Vatta, the round of result. But, dear listeners, we have pointed out to you in our explanation of the Mahanidana Sutta that the Vatta interpretation that is actually relevant to the law of dependent arising is that between consciousness and name and form. We have cited on several occasions a very deep section of the Buddha's sermon that confirms it. On this occasion, too, let me quote it for the benefit of those who are newcomers. Ittavata ko ananda jayetava jiyetava miyetava chavetava uppajjetava ittavata adivachanapatho ittavata niruttipatho ittavata panyatipatho ittavata panyavacharang ittavata vattang vattati ithattang panyapanaya yadidang namarupang saha vinyanena. Insofar only, Ananda, can one be born or grow old, or die, or pass away, or reappear. Insofar only is there any pathway for verbal expression. Insofar only is there any pathway for terminology. Insofar only is there any pathway for designation. Insofar only is there any sphere of wisdom. Insofar only is there a whirling round of pointing out a thisness, that is to say, as far as name and form together with consciousness. In this exposition we have birth, decay, and death, and all the rest of it. Nothing is lacking. Venerable Sariputta, the foremost in wisdom, presents this more clearly through a very simple simile in the Nalakalapa Sutta, in answer to a series of questions raised by the Venerable Mahakotthita. It is a wonderful simile. Just as, friend, 2 sheaves of reeds are made to stand one supporting the other at the top, so consciousness stands with name and form as condition. And then, with name and form as condition, there are the 6 sense spheres: contact, feeling, craving, etc. Out of these 2 sheaves of reeds, if one is drawn, the other falls down. If the other is drawn, this will fall down. In the same way, the cessation aspect is explained as follows. With the cessation of consciousness, the cessation of name and form occurs, and along with the cessation of name and form, 6 sense spheres: contact, feeling, craving, grasping, and the rest of it falls. Just try to visualize this. Out of the 2 sheaves of reeds, suppose the one on the left is the consciousness sheaf of reeds. The one on the right side is the name and form sheaf of reeds. A number of other sheaves of reeds are leaning on the name and form sheaf of reeds. All those would fall if the name and form sheaf of reeds falls. Now you can understand why this is called sanditthiko, visible here and now, akaliko, timeless, and ehipassiko, inviting one to come and see. There is no need to bring in 3 periods of time into the interpretation of the Paṭicca Samuppāda formula. Now that we have said all this about the exposition in Visuddhimagga, let us go on to another point. Out of the above-mentioned mutual interdependence, even as a corollary of it, something called a duality, dvayata, comes up. We have made use of the Dvayata Sutta in selecting topics for a number of our sermons. As you may recall, there is a duality of arising and ceasing, samudaya nirodha. There is another duality of internal, external, ajhatta bahiddha. It is these two dualities that you come across throughout the Satipatthana Sutta. We have spoken about the two phrases, iti ajhattang va kaye, bahiddha va kaye, whether in the internal body or in the external body, and samudaya dhammanupassiva vaya dhammanupassiva, either seeing the arising nature or the passing away nature. This is the duality. But our Theravada tradition has not recognized this term. It has not come up in the traditional exegesis. However, we pointed out its importance. There are two discourses in the Salayatana Sangyutta of the Sangyutta Nikaya by the same titled Dvayang Dyad. In one Dvayang Sutta, we find the Buddha addressing the monks and saying, "Monks, I shall preach to you about a dyad." What is the dyad? Eye and forms, ears and sounds, nose and smells, tongue and tastes, body and tangibles, mind and mind objects. This is the dyad. Then the Buddha declares a very striking challenge. If someone says, "I will reject this dyad and make known some other dyad," it will only be a vain boast. When questioned, he would not be able to make good his boast, and furthermore, he would come to vexation. Just see. All that is about the duality. In the other Dvayang Sutta, this is how it comes up. Dvayang bhikkave paticca viññāṇaṃ sambhoti. Consciousness, monks, arises depending on a dyad. Katancha bhikkave dvayang paticca viññāṇaṃ sambhoti. How, monks, does consciousness arise depending on a dyad? Chakkuncha paticca rupecha uppajjati chakku viññāṇaṃ. Depending on eye and forms arises eye consciousness. Then the Buddha makes another declaration. Chakkung aniccaṃ viparinami anyatha bhavi. Rupa anicca viparinamino anyatha bhavino. Eye is impermanent, changing and becoming otherwise. Forms are impermanent, changing and becoming otherwise. Then he goes on. Itthetang dvayang chalancheva vayancha aniccaṃ viparinami anyatha bhavi. Thus, this dyad is unstable, passing away, impermanent, changing and becoming otherwise. Just understand in brief that the question of the two is resolved through the teachings on impermanence. There is another significant discourse that corroborates the internal-external part of the implications of dvayang or dyad. There is in the Sangyutta Nikaya a discourse titled Balapandita Sutta, not to be confused with the Balapandita Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya. Let us bring up a section of that discourse. Avidya nivaranasya bhikkave balasya tanhaya sampayuttasya evayang kayo samudagato iti ayancheva kayo bahiddhacha namarupang. Itthetang dvayang paticca passo saleva yatanani yehi puttho balo sukhadukkhaṃ patisang vediyati ete sangva anyatarena. Monks, to the fool hindered by ignorance and fettered to craving, this body has come up. Thus, there is this body and name and form as external to it. Thus, there is this dyad. Depending on the dyad, there is contact, and the six sense spheres, contacted by which, or by any one of them, the fool experiences pleasure and pain. That would suffice as far as the significance of the dyad is concerned. Now let us pass on to the two words, hetu and paccaya. During the Buddha's time, those two words were used in every discourse as synonymous. Whenever the question comes up as ko hetu ko paccayo, what is the cause? What is the condition? The answer is one. There are no two answers. There is a delightful discourse titled Mahapunnama, which has as its setting a moonlit night out in the open air. The Buddha is seen answering questions raised by the monks. One monk, strangely enough, rattled out 5 questions, one after the other. Venerable Sir, what is the cause? What is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of form? What is the cause? What is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of feeling? What is the cause? What is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of perception? What is the cause? What is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of preparations? What is the cause? What is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of consciousness? Now the Buddha is answering. The 4 great primaries is the cause. The 4 great primaries is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of form. Contact is the cause. Contact is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of feeling. Contact is the cause. Contact is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of perception. Contact is the cause. Contact is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of preparations. Name and form is the cause. Name and form is the condition for the designation of an aggregate of consciousness. What we need to glean from this quotation is the fact we had pointed out, namely, that the 2 words were used synonymously in the discourses. But, dear listeners, it is evident that in the literature handed down as treatises, that is to say, in the Pacarana literature, a semantic change, an undesirable change of meanings has occurred. First of all, let me give an instance of it. In the section called Paṭicca Vibhanga, in the Nittipakarana, hetu and paccaya are distinguished as 2 words. This is how it comes up. Dve Dhamma janayanti hetu cha paccayo cha. 2 factors bring forth janayanti, something, cause and condition. Out of them, cause is said to be the special factor, asadharano hetu, and condition is said to be the common factor, sadharano paccayo. An illustration is also given. In the case of a germinating seed, the seed is called the cause, and conditions are earth and moisture. Then, in summing up, Nittipakarana says, Iti sambhavo hetu parabhavo paccayo, ajhattiko hetu bahiro paccayo, janako hetu pariggahako paccayo, asadharano hetu sadharano paccayo. In defining the 2 words, it says, hetu or cause is intrinsic nature, sambhavo, and paccaya or condition is extrinsic nature, parabhavo. Here we find an unusual semantic twist. Sabhavo, Sanskrit svabhava, is a word used in general for nature. Now it has become a technical term, so sabhavo is intrinsic nature. Parabhavo is extrinsic nature. Just see what a distortion it is. For the birth of a sapling or a seedling, the seed is said to be the cause, hetu, and other conditions such as earth, water, fire, and air are conditions, paccaya. But from the verses uttered by Sela Teri, it seems that all the three factors, seed, earth, and moisture, are essential. Then, ajhatiko hetu, cause is internal, bahiro pacchayo, condition is external. Then again, janako hetu, cause, is what brings forth or gives birth. Pariggāhako pacchayo, condition is what helps or contributes to it. Now we cannot help saying something about the patthānapakarana too. When we come to it, we find the number of conditions, paccaya, increasing up to 24. In the attempt to show the connection between thoughts, 24 conditions are listed. The first among them is called hetu, but not in the sense we mentioned above. So it seems at last hetu, cause, became one of the paccayas, conditions. To add to the confusion, now the scholars are at pains trying to establish the identity of the two conditions, anantara and samanantara, because the definition given to both happens to be the same. So this is the situation. Anyway, we do not wish to labor the point. Let us now pass on to Patisambhida Maggapakarana. When we come to it, we find a similar semantic change. This is how the two words hetu, cause, and hetu samuppanna, arisen from a cause, are explained in the Patisambhida Magga. Avidya hetu sankhara hetu samuppanna, sankhara hetu viññānaṃ hetu samuppannam. According to this interpretation, out of the 12 links, the one that precedes a link is the cause from which that particular link is arisen. But we have pointed out, with reference to the first two lines of the verse, Ye Dhamma hetuppabhava te sanghetum tathāgato aha, that what is called hetu is not ignorance or any other link but that basic principle of idappacchayata, specific conditionality. This being, this arises, etc. We have also shown that as for hetu samuppanna, each of these 12 links is arisen from a cause. Ignorance and other links are illustrations of the principle. This fact is further borne out by the qualification sometimes mentioned about a stream winner, sotapanna, that he has clearly seen the cause as well as things arisen from the cause. Hetu ca suditto hoti hetu samuppanne ca dhamme. But an even clearer proof of this fact, as we earlier pointed out, is the declaration made by the Buddha showing the distinction between the law of dependent arising, Paṭicca Samuppāda, and things dependently arisen, Paṭicca Samuppanna Dhamma. It is a momentous declaration. Jati paccaya bhikkhave jara maranam, uppadava tathāgatānaṃ anuppadava tathāgatānaṃ, tithava sadhatu dhammathithata dhammaniyamata idappacchayata. Dependent on birth is decay and death. Whether there be an arising of Tathāgatas or whether there be no arising of Tathāgatas, that elementary nature, that orderliness of the Dhamma, that norm of the Dhamma, the specific conditionality does stand as it is. What corroborates the interconnection between birth and decay is the norm that holds good whether there be an arising of Tathāgatas or there be no arising of Tathāgatas. That elementary nature stands as it is, tithava sadhatu. That is the suchness which cannot be changed, tatata. That specific conditionality, idappacchayata, is Paṭicca Samuppāda. Things dependently arisen, Paṭicca Samuppāda Dhamma, are the 12 links beginning with ignorance. They all are hetu samuppanna. Every one of them is impermanent, aniccaṃ, prepared, saṅkataṃ, and dependently arisen, paticca samuppannam. All this shows that an undesirable semantic change has occurred with the passage of time in regard to the law of dependent arising. There are enough instances in the discourses to prove that the 12-linked formula of Paṭicca Samuppāda has been presented as an answer to questions of extremists, which are of the dilemma type. The world rests on a duality, dvayanisita, the question of two things. Either it is or it is not. Either it exists or it does not exist. Either everything exists or nothing exists. Either it is one's own doing or another's doing. The worldlings are immersed in such a duality, dvayata. When such Brahmins come and raise questions, particularly in the Kaccanagutta Sutta, the Buddha pointed out that such questions with two ends rest on a duality, dvayanisita. Sabbang athiti ko kaccana ayang eko anto, sabbang nathiti ayang dutiyo anto. Ete te kaccana ubho ante anupagamma majjhena tathagato dhammang deseti avidjapacchaya sankhara, etc. To say everything exists, kaccana, is one extreme. Nothing exists, this is the second extreme. Without going to both extremes, kaccana, the Tathagata preaches the Dhamma by the middle, dependent on ignorance, preparations, etc. Without going to both extremes, the Tathagata brings up the 12-linked formula of dependent arising. In that exposition, both the direct anuloma and indirect patiloma orders are given. I hope you all can follow. Firstly, the direct order beginning with avidjapacchaya sankhara, dependent on ignorance, preparations. Then the Buddha follows it up with the indirect order, avidjayatveva asesa viraga nirodha, etc. But with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance, etc. Between these two we find samudaya, arising, and nirodha, ceasing. One cannot say something absolutely exists, or absolutely nothing exists. There is an arising and a ceasing. It is that norm that is called dependent arising, or Paṭicca Samuppāda. Not only that, sometimes a tetralemma beginning with one's own doing, sayankataṃ, another's doing, parankataṃ, and so on, as well as 6 dilemmas, were presented to the Buddha, but he answered them with the 12-linked formula. There are many who do not know why the Buddha puts forward these 12 links as his answer. Why does he do so? In it there is the solution in the present. It lays bare the structure of the problem. What is the structure? Within the background of ignorance, preparations arise. It is these preparations that keep up the vortex between consciousness and name and form. The outcome of that vortical interplay is bifurcation within the 6 sense spheres as internal and external. Now comes up the story of the dyad, dvayang, eye and forms, ear and sounds, etc. That is why we illustrated the mutual interdependence, anya manya paccayata, with reference to the simile of the 2 bundles of reeds. As a result of the bifurcation as internal and external in the case of the 6 sense spheres, the entire story of feeling, craving, grasping, becoming, and birth unfolds itself. Though we explain this way, you might not understand. Now, you had better recall the similes we have given while discussing the law of dependent arising. Many of you would follow when it comes in the form of similes. We have given various kinds of similes like the cinema and the magic world. Let us take it this way. Suppose there are several worlds. There is the cinema world. Now that we have spoken of the chess game between Ajit and Sumit, let us call it the gambler's world. Then there is the magic world and the cricket world. There is another world which the dog on the plank represented earlier. Later, we presented a more aesthetic simile in the form of the story of Narcissus. Everyone seems to like it. For those who haven't heard it before, let me give a summary of it. It is a Greek story we have read. A very handsome Greek youth who had never seen his own face, while wandering in a forest, bent down into a pond to wash his face. Seeing the reflection of his own face there, he imagined it to be an angel's. To embrace the angel, he had a vain struggle with the ripples for several days, and in the end sacrificed his life for love. And that, of course, was self-love. Other affections are no better. We have to call it the world of romance. So we have now a lot of worlds. The cinema world, the gambler's world, the magic world, the cricket world, and the romantic world. Now let us see how in each of these worlds those 12 links of the Paṭicca Samuppāda formula play their part. Think of the cinema world to begin with. When does the film show actually start? When the entire cinema hall is steeped in darkness. At that moment, the eyes get focused on the screen. Then the diluted interplay begins. In that strange world, all the preparations of the actors and actresses become meaningful in the darkness. When the interval comes and lights are turned on, all the variety of colors on the screen fade away. But it is between the screen and the background of darkness that a wonderful world is created with the help of the behavior of actors and actresses. That is the delusion. Then why does one go to the cinema hall and buy a ticket? To get deluded. What is the reason? The entire world is a world of sensuality. Within this sensual world, there are many tiny, tiny worlds, which we already named. The cinema world is easily understood. Then let us take up the magic world. The magic world exists until the magician's subtle tricks are understood. As soon as one discovers them, at least by hiding in some corner of the stage, the magic world is no more. Now, what about the gambler's world? We have clearly portrayed it with the help of the chess game between Ajit and Sumit. To put it in brief, that world exists on the chessboard. Those worthless pieces become chessmen. When the Zen master compelled the two friends to play a deadly chess game, a gamble for life, with sword in hand, threatening to behead the loser, both of them mutually made up their minds to sacrifice their life for each other. But just at the critical moment of judging the winner and the loser, what did the Zen master do? He bent down and swept off the pieces from the chessboard, and that was the end of the game. Isn't that enough for you to understand the gambler's world? Then, as for the cricket world, we need not describe it for you. You all know about it. But this is what has to be pointed out as important. When the two teams get down to the cricket ground, the paraphernalia of the game dazzle with life. Players are dubbed with strange names. From then onwards, it is all delusion. The cricket delusion is so powerful that in the end some even commit suicide. So that is the cricket world. Between victory and defeat, all the 12 links are there, even birth and death, grief, lamentation, pain, unhappiness, despair, and all the rest of it. Then the world of romance. About that you all know more than we do. There again, either it is self-love or love for another. It is that love for each other that make them say, "Of course the world outside is suffering, but when we are together, our world is wonderful." The day that soap bubble vanishes into thin air, there is suicide or murder. So that is the world of romance. Remember, in every one of those worlds, it is the 12 links that come into play. What is of particular importance is that vortex, vata. The real rallying point is the mutual interrelation between consciousness and name and form. It is a very strange kind of a delusion. That is why we said, if you ask consciousness, "Who are you?" it would reply, "Ask name and form." If you ask name and form, "Who are you?" it would also reply, "Ask consciousness." The two are neither to be reckoned as two, nor are they one and the same. There is a delusion involved. That is why we pointed out that what is called nama-rupa is a formal name and a nominal form. It is only a perception of form. But it is in name and form that consciousness finds an object. It is here that a world is created. All that happens within the darkness of ignorance. In that darkness of ignorance, a preparation goes on. It is that preparation that in the Dhamma is called kaya sankharo, body preparation, vaci sankharo, speech preparation, and citta sankharo, thought preparation. So much so, as we mentioned on an earlier occasion, in order to escape from the round of existence, all those 3 preparations have to be stilled. Breathing in and breathing out are reckoned as the body preparation, kaya sankharo. Thinking and pondering are the speech preparation, vaci sankharo. And perception and feeling are the thought preparation, citta sankharo. These constitute the infrastructure of existence. That is why the yogins in the past stilled those preparations. Nibbāna is called sabba sankhara samatha, the stilling of all preparations. When all preparations are stilled, that is the end of the whole story. But these are not stilled automatically. It is when the light of wisdom dawns that they are stilled. That is what we call anidassana vijnana, non-manifestative consciousness. Consciousness ceases, name and form ceases. In various ways we described it, whether you call it salayatana nirodha, cessation of the 6 sense spheres, vijnana nirodha, cessation of consciousness, or nama-rupa nirodha, cessation of name and form, it is the same. It shows that the Buddha solved this problem in the present itself. This is a wonderful Dhamma, a marvelous Dhamma. Though we say so, you might wonder why all these facts have not come to light all this time. Neither the commentators nor the Western scholars could understand such deep suttas like Mula Pariyaya, Madhupindika, Mahanidana, and Mahapadana. They were relegated to the limbo as abstruse discourses. What is the reason? There must be some reason. What is it? This is the reason, dear listeners. In the history of this dispensation, an unfortunate thing had happened at some stage or other. Those extremely deep discourses were branded as Vohara Desana, conventional sermons, and pushed into obscurity. In their place, other things came to be upheld as deep. The Buddha must have foreseen this predicament, for he had made a prophecy that in future such monks would get the upper hand. yete suttanta tathagata bhasita gambhirata lokuttara sunyata patisangyutta tesu bhanyamanesu na sussu sissanti na sotang odahissanti na anya chittang upathapesanti na te uggahe tabbang pariyapuni tabbang manyissanti. Whatever discourses that are preached by the Tathagata, that are deep and profound in meaning, transcendental and dealing with voidness, when those discourses are being spoken about, they would not listen to them. They would not lend ear to them. They would not make up their minds to understand them. They would not think it worthwhile learning and mastering them. This is precisely what came to pass. At present, Vohara Desana, or the so-called conventional teachings, are supposed to have been addressed to simple people like us. You know, there were instances when such discourses like Bahya Sutta helped the listeners to attain fruits of the path or even arahanthood. But, unfortunately, for some reason or other, those sermons were branded as conventional teachings and relegated to the background. That is the reason for all this confusion. At present, what is called Paṭicca Samuppāda is a formula to be by-hearted and recited up and down. It has no other significance. But it is with this formula that the Buddha not only solved the entire samsaric puzzle, but presented through it a wonderful principle that lays bare the structure of the realms of form and formless realms, as well as that of the miniature worlds found within this sensuous realm, as we highlighted above. This fact has been ignored all this time. It is because of this ignorance that they went on taking liberties with the two words, hetu and paccaya. We can't change the Buddha word. If the Buddha has used the couple of words synonymously, we have to accept it as it is. Playing with these two words had gone so far that concepts totally foreign to the spirit of the Dhamma came to be tagged on with the passage of time. That is why they went to the extent of bringing in, like Brahmins, such concepts as one's own doing and another's doing, or interpreting hetu as intrinsic nature, sabhava, and paccaya as extrinsic nature, parabhava. This confusion is not of recent origin. It has gone on for quite a long time. Our ideas may appear as revolutionary, but I cannot help pointing this out. The truth must come to light, even in the face of criticism. So then, dear listeners, in regard to the law of dependent arising, you should pay special attention to what we have said about sangsaravatta, the vortex of samsara, and anyamanya paccayata, the mutual interdependence, and the interconnection between consciousness and name and form. The term vijnana itself is suggestive of two things. Vijnāti means discriminating as two things. It is due to that very discrimination that name and form becomes the object of consciousness. That happens in the darkness of ignorance, which makes one grasp at the shadow. Name and form is only a shadow or a reflection. That is where the story of the deer and the mirage comes in. It leads to an imprisonment between two things. I is here, form is over there. The deer is unaware of the fact that with each step it is taking its I along with it. Therefore, it has posited two ends or driven two pegs for itself. The whole world has got caught between these two pegs and created a dichotomy to rest on, dvaya nisita. The Buddha gave a solution to this problem by giving up both extremes, not by putting them together, nor by compromising with them, but by avoiding both. The solution he gave is the 12-linked formula of dependent arising. By this solution, the Buddha, for one thing, solved the samsaric puzzle. Why did the commentator bring in the question of past lives and future lives into the interpretation of this formula? They could not appreciate the fact that if you understand the present life in samsara correctly, the past and the future are already understood. Just ponder over this, dear listeners. Must you go on removing the sheaves of a plantain trunk to ascertain whether the tree has a pith? If you take a sharp sword and cut the trunk in two in the middle, can you not see from the cross-section that it is pithless? That is why a stream winner, Sotapanna, is said to have seen Nibbāna. We have explained earlier that he is said to have seen Nibbāna because, for a split second, he has seen in a flash the cessation of preparations in the light of wisdom. In one of our Nibbāna sermons, we have compared it to the legendary Herculean feat of the soldier Nila in parting the sea water with a giant iron bar. If the Sotapanna has had that flash of insight, he has discovered the secret of samsara to that extent. Of course, all fetters to existence are not broken by that initial insight. That realization is gradual, but it is because of this insight into the truth that he is irreversibly inclined to Nibbāna. He has thereby won the assurance of Nibbāna. He has had a glimpse of the true state of affairs, which is none other than the law of dependent arising. This being, this comes to be. Nowadays, when speaking about that attainment, there are many who go on asserting, "We keep our precepts unbroken. We are already Sotapanna." That is not the criterion. One has to see the norm of the Dhamma couched in the phrase, "Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang, sabbang nirodha dhammang." Whatever is of a nature to arise, all that is of a nature to cease. Through that insight, one has seen the norm of arising and ceasing. He has, for a moment, experienced the cessation of consciousness. Consciousness is what one grasps at last. By seeing its cessation, he has understood the nature of arising and ceasing of the entire five aggregates. It is by that insight into the truth that he is inclined to Nibbāna. He is irreversible. By that much alone a stream winner is great. Of course, he has to proceed further. The Buddha has pointed out that it is when one directs radical attention, yoniso manasikara, that there is this breakthrough. I have now said enough about Nibbāna. About this series of sermons I have to say something more. I have shown that there has been some historical evolution in the interpretation of the law of dependent arising. These sermons might give rise to all sorts of criticism. So I would like to mention that there is a history for this little series of sermons too. Though it is something personal, let me tell you about it. About 20 years ago, when I was at Mitrigala Nissarana Vinaya, my revered teacher, the Most Venerable Matra Sri Ñāṇarāma Mahatera, once, when I saw him in his kuti, invited me to deliver a series of sermons on Nibbāna to the meditative Sangha there, as they had some problems in understanding it. He even said that the sermons should be taped. But my first response, with a simile, was that if I came out with what I have to say, I would be the target of heavy criticism. But the next day he encouraged me with a wonderful guarantee. You had better mention in the sermon itself that I invited you to give these sermons. It is because of that guarantee that you had the opportunity to listen to the series of sermons on Nibbāna and read the Nibbāna volumes, i.e. Nibbāna, the mind-stilled series in 7 volumes. If not for that, these things would have continued to remain concealed under the sands of time. I came to know that those who had a myopic eye for the Nibbāna series 20 years ago are now showing a deep interest in it. In the meantime, some suggested to me the feasibility of writing a book on dependent arising. But instead of writing a book, I thought it easier to deliver a series of sermons to you all, because you have already listened to more than 100 of my sermons. I had the confidence that you would not get up and go, complaining that the sermons are too deep. That is why I started this series of sermons. But one thing, dear listeners, a preacher's mode of presentation adapts itself to the level of understanding of the audience. 20 years ago, I addressed those Nibbāna sermons to the meditative Sangha of Mitrigala Nissarana Vanaya. Some of the similes I gave in those sermons are now well known in the country. But in these sermons addressed to a village audience, I gave similes direct from village life, even rustic ones. I suppose it does not detract our respect for the Dhamma. Please try your best to understand this deep Dhamma through them. It is because of the depth of this Dhamma that the Buddha hesitated to preach it at first, that Brahma Sahampati had to bend his knees to propitiate and invite him to preach. We have already mentioned on an earlier occasion that there are 2 things in this Dhamma that are considered exceptionally deep. As it is said in suttas like Ariya Pariyesana, Duddhasang idang thanang yadidang idhapachayata Paṭicca Samuppāda. This is something difficult to see, namely, the specific conditionality, the dependent arising. It is not easy for the worldlings immersed in defilements to see the law of dependent arising. So also the cessation, Nirodha, which is Nibbāna. That too is difficult for the world to see. It comes with the cessation of preparations. Instead of that, the worldlings are steeped in the craving for existence or becoming. Bhavatanha, all speculative views come ancillary to it. This dispensation is threefold as precept, practice, and penetration. Pariyatti, Patipatti, Pativedha. Out of these, the first to suffer from neglect was penetration. Then practice, too, gradually went down. In the end, only precept remained. So the intellectuals came to the forefront. From there onwards, it was the age of commentaries, treatises, and compendia. It happened not only in our Theravada tradition, but in other sects as well. It is said that 18 sects sprang up even before the lapse of 100 years from the Buddha's passing away. Not only that, each sect had its scriptural heritage, cartloads of books. It was rarely that one with discernment took the trouble to make sense out of them. Therefore, you must not rest satisfied merely with listening to these sermons, but make an effort to understand them. Don't be discouraged, thinking, we are worldlings, without that wisdom to understand such things. The Buddha has pointed out the seed of wisdom, that is, radical attention, yoniso manasikara. We all have that in us to some extent or other. I have shown it by the simile of the 5 fingers. I shall repeat it for the benefit of the newcomers. Up to now, they explained the constituents of nama in nama-rupa differently, giving first place to phassa or contact. I gave the simile of the 5 fingers, feeling, vedana, the little finger, perception, sanya, the ring finger, intention, cetana, the middle finger, contact, phassa, the index finger, and attention, manasikara, the thumb. Out of these, taking attention as the thumb, we pointed out with the help of a simile of a case of murder or theft, how a judge gives crown pardon to an alleged culprit when there are no witnesses, and gets the whole mystery out through him. The Buddha had to do a similar thing because this samsaric problem is so difficult to solve, since consciousness is a magician's trick. That is why the Buddha gave attention out of the 5 constituents of name, nama, free pardon, and made him the crown witness. But he was made to give an oath of speaking the truth, as if warning him. You are the guy in the guise of ayoniso manasikara, non-radical attention, who committed this samsaric crime, with the other 4 guys plotting for the murder of all beings from beginningless times. At least now you had better be yoniso, radical. That was the beginning. We have shown what happens when yoniso manasikara reaches the climax of its development. It is with the help of this radical attention that one understands feeling as feeling. You should think why in the Satipatthana Sutta there are the apparently awkward phrases like kaye kayanupassi, contemplating body in the body, and vedanasu vedanapnupassi, contemplating feeling in feeling. When one gives evidence under an oath, one cannot help coming out with the truth. Feeling as feeling, perception as perception, intention as intention. But one thing, in the end, the culprit, the biggest culprit, is found guilty through his own confession. He is caught by his talk about the thing, manasikara sambhava sabbe dhamma. All things are found out by attention. That is the deepest point. Mind finds out a thing by means of manasikara. As we already mentioned, out of the 5 members on the nama side, namely feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention, attention is the thumb. It is the thumb, with the complicity of the other 4 fingers, is carrying on this gang murder. He has the closest connection with contact, the index finger. We have identified the 5 fingers. Of course, this is not a part of the Buddha's teaching. I give this simile only for clarification of issues involved. So, then, take it that we all have the ability to arouse yoniso manasikara, get it awakened. It is then that there is the dispelling of the 4 perversions, vipallasa, in place of the 4 perceptions so far pursued, namely the perception of permanence, nicca sanya, the perception of the pleasant, sukha sanya, the perception of beauty, subha sanya, and the perception of self, atta sanya. One begins to develop the perception of impermanence, anicca sanya, the perception of suffering, dukkha sanya, the perception of repulsiveness, asubha sanya, and the perception of not self, anatta sanya, according to the method of contemplation taught by the Buddha. That is the great revolution in one's way of attention. Then the world one sees is far different from the above-mentioned worlds. This is a Dhamma that penetrates through the world. Gradually, the perception of the compact Ghanasanya, which made one posit 2 ends, gets liquidated through the contemplation of impermanence, aniccanupassana. What happens with that liquidation? The perception of the heap, rasi sanya, emerges. One begins to see a thing as a heap. Thereby the contemplation of impermanence goes deeper. One sees the flux of arising and ceasing. It culminates in disenchantment or disgust, Nibbāna. In this Dhamma, Nibbāna is the key to Nibbāna. There is such a norm of Dhamma in this teaching. Supramundane paths and fruits cannot be realized through learning by heart the Dhamma or by getting certificates. You have to get down into the proper practice. It is to those who had practiced deeply in this Dhamma in past births, like Bahya, that the Buddha preached very brief sermons like, "In the scene, just the scene." It may not apply to everybody. You have to start from the nursery itself. That is why virtue, concentration, and wisdom have to be developed. Backed by them, gradually one comes to realize those supramundane attainments. It may be a miserable leper like Suppabuddha. If he came to the Buddha with the correct sansaric maturity, he could realize immediately, on hearing the Buddha's sermon, that norm of the Dhamma enshrined in the dictum, Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang sabbang tang nirodha dhammang. Whatever is of a nature to arise, all that is of a nature to cease. It is the insight based on the 5 aggregates of grasping, which in effect is the insight into the law of dependent arising. The Buddha has proclaimed this regarding the law of dependent arising. Uppadava tathagatānaṃ, anuppadava tathagatānaṃ, tithava sa dhātu dhammathitata, dhamma niyamata iddappacchayata. Whether there be an arising of the Tathagatas, or whether there be no arising of Tathagatas, that elementary nature, that orderliness of the Dhamma, that norm of the Dhamma, the specific conditionality does stand as it is. About this law of dependent arising, the Buddha has used such words of affirmation like tathata, avitathata, ananyathata, idappacchayata. That suchness therein, the invariability, the not otherwiseness, the specific conditionality. When one sees this norm as a fact of realization, instead of saying impermanent, one begins to see the flux of arising and passing away. This is the path outlined in this Dhamma. Therefore, this series of sermons is not meant for the scholar to pass exams and get degrees. Think of the purpose of these sermons, their practical aspect. But what has been happening all this time? A basket was simply handed down without examining what's in it. Our teacher has said this. We must not go beyond it. Our commentators have explained like this. We must not think beyond their explanation. A vast delusion has gone on for a long period, getting hold of the brains, lay and monk alike. Ignoring those extremely profound discourses, they ran after other things. I won't say here what they are, but the truth is here. Worldlings do not see it. We had to say in our Nibbāna sermons, too, that a path of Dhamma overgrown for a number of centuries had to be cleared up. On this occasion, too, it has to be reiterated. We showed the interrelation between name and form and consciousness in both aspects of arising and ceasing. The world is always on the samudaya side, arising side. Though there is nightfall today, there is a dawn tomorrow. That is their way of thinking. They do not like even to think of nirodha, cessation. That is why we gave various similes. The seamstress, craving, stitches up those two ends, but it is when one sees the middle that there is a release. Now that we have mentioned about those two ends, let us hark back to that wonderful verse preached by the Buddha. Yo ubante viditvana majhe manta nalippati tang brumi mahapurisoti sodhav sibba nimmachaga. He who, having understood both ends, does not get attached to the middle with wisdom, him I call a great man. He has gone beyond the seamstress here. 6 interpretations were given for this verse, but out of them let me now mention a few. Pleasant feeling is one end, painful feeling is the other end. The middle is neither painful nor pleasant feeling. Which is the middle that no one is interested in? The 6 internal sense spheres is one end. The 6 external sense spheres is the other end. Consciousness is the middle. It is due to the magic trick of consciousness that those two ends are separated. Then again, name is one end and form is the other end. It is through ignorance of the fact that consciousness is in the middle that many scholars go on explaining name and form like materialistic scientists. The term rupa is interpreted as in physics, but we have pointed out that what we have here is only a perception of form, rupa sanya. It is with the help of the constituents of the name group that form is recognized. That is the basics for any consciousness. Rupa cannot be understood by such materialistic analysis. You can't change this Dhamma into an atomistic study. One has to see what actually is here. How can one see it? Certainly not through instruments. One can do it only through radical attention, yoniso manasikara. It is for that virtue, concentration and wisdom are required. This is what we presented through our sermons. Therefore, you should not think that these are too abstruse for us. Some are even scared of the term Paṭicca Samuppāda. They would say, that is something even the author of Visuddhimagga could not understand. So how could we do it? That seems to be the general attitude. But the truth is here in the discourses, which they underestimate as too simple, conventional teachings, vohara desana. It is in such underrated discourses like Mahanidana and Mahapadana that the true explanation of Paṭicca Samuppāda is found. One has to intuit into the meaning without getting involved in words. Of course, all these are wordly conventions. They are the pathways of synonyms and terminology. Every vortex revolves round with the synonyms and terminology proper to it. Think, for instance, about the cricket world. As you know, it has its own ways of synonyms and terminology. It is within that environment that the cricket craze goes on. That is what gives rise to an ithata, or a level of existence. Birth, decay, and death go with it. Regarding that too, there is a very wonderful discourse which we have already discussed. Let me now mention it in brief. Kayeva bhikkhave sati kaya sancetana hetu uppajjati ajhattang sukha dukkhang vachaya va bhikkhave sati vachi sancetana hetu uppajjati ajhattang sukha dukkhang mane va bhikkhave sati mano sancetana hetu uppajjati ajhattang sukha dukkhang avijjapacchaya va. To put it simply, when one has taken for granted that there is a body, due to intentions about the body, there arise inward pleasure and pain. When one takes for granted that there is speech, due to verbal intentions, there arise inward pleasure and pain. When one takes for granted that there is a mind, due to mental intentions, there arise inward pleasure and pain. Finally, it is said, avidya paccayava, all conditioned by ignorance. But then it goes on to say, avidya yatveva asesa viraga nirodha sokayo nahoti yang paccayasa tang uppajjati ajhatang sukhadukkang sa vacha nahoti yang paccayasa tang uppajjati ajhatang sukhadukkang somano nahoti yang paccayasa tang uppajjati ajhatang sukhadukkang. But with the remainderless fading away and cessation of ignorance, that body is not there, owing to which there arise for him inward pleasure and pain. That speech is not there, owing to which there arise for him inward pleasure and pain. That mind is not there, owing to which there arise for him inward pleasure and pain. Then it is said in affirmation, Kettang tang nahoti, vatung tang nahoti, ayatanang tang nahoti, adhikaranang tang nahoti, yampachayasa tang uppajjati ajhatang sukhadukkang. That field is not there. That sight is not there. That base is not there. That reason is not there, owing to which there can arise for him that inward pleasure and pain. That field, that sight, that base, that reason which sustained all those are not there once ignorance ceases. That is what we try to point out in various ways. Well, everything comes to an end. When I started this series of sermons, I expressed my misgivings, as I did in the case of Nibbāna sermons, whether I would live long enough to complete the series. However, I survived the series. So, I would like to wind up with a transference of merit. Whatever merit that accrued by my efforts to clean up a path of Dhamma overgrown for centuries, may it be rejoiced over by my departed parents who brought me up, teachers who gave me the vision of knowledge, and lay supporters who helped keep this frail body alive. Whatever beings there be, from the lowest hell to the highest Brahma world, may they too rejoice over that merit. May it conduce to their attainment of deathless Nibbāna. In this series of sermons, I made use of various sections of the discourses. So, let this floral garland of sermons, woven out of the well-preached Dhamma flowers, culled from the garden of profound discourses, be a humble offering at the foot of the Dhamma shrine, which received honor and worship from the Buddha himself. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And here ends Bhante Ñāṇananda's sermons on the dependent arising, the secret of bondage and release.